The early morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Austin, Texas, as people hurried past a weathered bench outside the gleaming Tesla showroom. On this bench sat James Cooper, a 68-year-old former sheriff who now called his old pickup truck home. His clothes were clean but worn, and despite his circumstances, he maintained the alert posture that came from 3 decades in law enforcement. 8 months had passed since he'd lost his home. Every morning, he'd park himself on this bench, watching the comings and goings at the facility while sipping coffee from a disposable cup. The employees had grown used to his presence, occasionally offering him fresh coffee or a kind word. He never asked for anything more. This morning felt different somehow. The usual buzz around the showroom had intensified, with staff members straightening their clothes and checking their phones nervously. James noticed a few black SUVs pulling up, but what caught his attention was a tall figure walking briskly toward the entrance. James recognized him instantly. Elon Musk wasn't hard to spot, especially not in front of his own showroom. What happened next would have seemed unbelievable if someone had told James about it the day before. Musk was half past the bench when he stopped suddenly, his attention caught by something. James later realized it was his faded sheriff's badge tattoo, visible on his forearm as he lifted his coffee cup. There was a moment of silence as their eyes met. "That's an interesting tattoo," Musk said, gesturing to James's arm. His voice was casual, genuinely curious rather than condescending. 30 years on the force," James replied simply, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Austin County Sheriff's Department." Instead of continuing into the building, Musk surprised everyone by settling down on the bench. His security team shifted uncomfortably, but maintained their distance. "How long have you been watching my facility?" he asked. James couldn't help but chuckle. "Long enough to notice your delivery trucks are taking the wrong route. There's a better way through the side streets that would save you about 20 minutes per trip. Used to patrol those roads every day." Musk's eyes lit up with interest, and what started as a casual observation turned into a detailed discussion about local traffic patterns, security vulnerabilities, and the kind of insights that only come from years of law enforcement experience. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on James's career, the challenges of keeping a large facility secure, and the changing landscape of Austin. Not once did James hint at his current situation or ask for help. Instead, he spoke with the authority and dignity that comes from a lifetime of public service. The morning sun climbed higher as they talked, and James could see the surprise on the faces of employees who walked past. Here was their CEO, sitting on bench, deep in conversation with a homeless man. But in that moment, James wasn't homeless. He was a professional sharing his expertise, his current circumstances temporarily forgotten in the flow of meaningful discussion. Little did James know that this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would not only change his life, but impact countless others in the process. As Musk finally stood to leave, he pulled out his phone and made a quick note. The real story was just beginning. Life hadn't always been this hard for James Cooper. Just 3 years ago, he had everything. A loving wife named Linda, a cozy home with a wraparound porch, and a retirement filled with fishing trips and morning coffees on their back deck. But life has a way of changing course when you least expect it. Linda's cancer diagnosis came like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. What started as a routine checkup turned into a 2-year battle that drained not just their spirits, but every penny they'd saved. James remembered the nights spent in hospital corridors, the way Linda would still try to smile through her pain, and how she'd squeeze his hand 3 times, their secret code for "I love you." The medical bills piled up faster than autumn leaves. First went their savings, then their retirement fund, and finally, their home. James didn't regret a single penny spent trying to save Linda. She was worth every dime and more. He'd tell anyone who'd listen, his voice soft but firm. After Linda passed, James tried to keep their house, picking up odd security jobs and selling off their possessions one by one. But eventually, reality caught up. His pension barely covered basic needs, let alone the mountain of medical debt. The day he sold their home felt like losing Linda all over again. His old pickup truck became his new home, packed with what little he could keep. His uniforms, Linda's photo album, and the coffee mug she'd given him on their 30th anniversary. Each night, he'd park in a different spot, sometimes near the park where he and Linda used to walk, other times near the sheriff's office where he'd spent most of his life serving others. The Tesla showroom became his regular spot by accident. One morning, feeling particularly low, he'd stop there to rest. Something about watching people go about their day, seeing the rhythm of the city he protected for so long, gave him a sense of purpose. He kept his truck clean, showered at the local gym where he still maintained a basic membership, and never caused any trouble. Other homeless folks in the area respected him, sometimes coming to him for advice or help dealing with local authorities. Even in his hardest times, James never lost his instinct to protect and serve. He'd break up fights before they started, guide lost tourists, and keep an eye on the area with the same dedication he's shown as sheriff. His encounter with Elon Musk that morning had stirred something in him, a reminder of who he used to be, of the respect his uniform once commanded. As he watched Musk's security team follow their boss into the building, James sipped his cooling coffee, unaware that his life was about to change dramatically. Inside the Tesla facility, Musk had already started making calls. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James's story, more to the sharp observations and dignified bearing of the man on the bench. What happened next would prove that sometimes life's greatest turning points come disguised as ordinary moments. Inside the Tesla office, a team of investigators quietly began looking into James Cooper's background. His story checked out perfectly: 30 years of dedicated service, multiple commendations for bravery, and a spotless record. They found newspaper clippings about him saving a family from a house fire, organizing community safety programs, and even starting a youth mentorship initiative. The medical bills that had bankrupted him were all there too. A paper trail showing how a good man's life had crumbled under the weight of trying to save his wife. The investigators were moved by what they found, especially the letters of support from community members when James had finally been forced to sell his home. 1 week after their bench conversation, James was surprised to see Elon Musk approaching him again. This time, Musk wasn't alone. He had brought his facility manager and head of security. James straightened up, his old professional instincts kicking in. "Mr. Cooper," Musk said, "I've been thinking about our conversation last week. Your insights about the delivery routes, we implemented them. They've already saved us considerable time and fuel costs." James nodded politely, unsure where this was going. The morning sun was warm on his face as he listened. "But what really caught my attention," Musk continued, "was your understanding of security. You spotted 3 potential vulnerabilities in our setup just from sitting here on this bench. That's the kind of experience money can't buy." The facility manager stepped forward, holding a folder. "Mr. Cooper, we'd like to offer you a position: Security Operations Advisor for the Austin facility. We need someone with your experience, someone who knows this city inside and out." James's hand trembled slightly as he took the folder. Inside was a job offer, a real one, with benefits, housing allowance, and a salary that reflected his decades of experience. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "This isn't charity," Musk said firmly, seeming to read James's thoughts. "We need your expertise. Those delivery route changes you suggested, they're saving us thousands per week. Imagine what you could do from the inside." James looked at the papers, then at the building he'd been watching for months. He thought about Linda, about how she'd always told him his greatest strength was helping others. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. "When do I start?" "Right now, if you're ready," Musk replied with a slight smile. "Though you might want to change benches. That one's a bit far from your new office." As James stood up, he felt the weight of the past few years starting to lift. He picked up his small bag of belongings. Tomorrow, he'd move his truck's contents into actual housing. But for now, he had work to do. Walking into the Tesla facility, James noticed employees smiling at him. Not with pity like before, but with respect. He'd come full circle, from protecting his community with a badge to protecting it in a different way. Sometimes, he realized, life's greatest comebacks start with a simple conversation on a bench. James's first month at Tesla was a whirlwind of activity. His new office, though modest, felt like a palace compared to his truck. The small desk held a framed photo of Linda, and he'd hang his jacket on the coat rack each morning, just like old times at the sheriff's office. His experience quickly proved invaluable. The security team was good, but James saw things differently. He noticed how delivery drivers would bunch up at certain times, creating blind spots. He spotted ways that someone could potentially access restricted areas, not because the security was weak, but because old buildings had quirks that only a trained eye could catch. One morning, James was reviewing security footage when he noticed something odd. A pattern in the early morning deliveries showed trucks waiting unnecessarily at the main gate. He remembered similar traffic issues from his sheriff days and drew up a new schedule that spread deliveries across different times and entrances. The results were immediate. Delivery times dropped by 40%, and drivers reported less stress. When word reached Elon Musk, he didn't just acknowledge the improvement. He asked James to implement similar systems at other Tesla facilities. But what really changed things was the day James stopped a potential disaster. He'd noticed a delivery truck driver looking unusually nervous. Something about the way the man kept checking his phone and wiping his forehead didn't sit right with James's trained instincts. Instead of calling security, James walked over and started a friendly conversation. It turned out the driver was planning to help steal a shipment of valuable parts. But James's kind approach, asking about the man's family and showing genuine concern, led to a breakdown and confession. The driver had been threatened and forced into the scheme. Thanks to James's intervention, not only was the theft prevented, but a major crime ring was exposed. This incident caught Musk's attention in a big way. James hadn't just stopped a theft. He demonstrated how human understanding could prevent problems before they started. Musk called him to a meeting the next day. "Your approach to security is different," Musk said, leaning back in his chair. "You don't just look for threats. You look for people who need help." James nodded. "In 30 years as sheriff, I learned that most problems can be solved by treating people with respect. Sometimes, folks just need someone to listen." That conversation led to something bigger than James could have imagined. Musk asked him to develop a new security training program, one that would combine professional vigilance with human compassion. But more importantly, he wanted James to start a hiring initiative. "We need more people like you," Musk explained. "Veterans, former law enforcement, good people who've fallen on hard times. Give them the same chance you got." James felt his throat tighten. He thought about his own journey, from that bench outside to where he sat now. He could help others make the same journey. James's new hiring program started small, but grew quickly. His first hire was Bill, a former Marine who'd been sleeping in his car after losing his security job. Like James, Bill had a sharp eye for detail and a way of handling people that couldn't be taught in training sessions. Next came Tom, a retired police officer who'd lost everything in a house fire. James saw in him the same dedication to duty that he carried through his own hard times. Each new hire brought their own story and their own unique skills to the team. Word spread through the veteran and law enforcement communities. People who'd fallen on hard times but still had so much to offer found their way to Tesla's door. James interviewed each one personally, often over coffee on that same bench where his own story had changed. The new security team quickly became known as one of the best in the industry. They didn't just guard buildings, they created a community. They helped local homeless people find shelters, connected struggling veterans with support services, and turned the facility into a place where everyone felt safe. One day, James received a surprise visit from a city council member. The council had noticed the positive changes around the Tesla facility: lower crime rates, better traffic flow, and most importantly, fewer homeless veterans on the streets. They wanted to know his secret. "It's simple," James explained, walking with the council member through the facility. "These folks never lost their skills or their desire to serve. They just needed someone to believe in them again." The program's success caught media attention. Local news stations ran stories about the Tesla security family as they became known. Other companies started calling, asking how they could set up similar programs. But James's proudest moment came when he overheard two of his team members talking. One was helping the other move into a new apartment, their first stable home in years. They were planning a small housewarming party and invited James to join. That evening, sitting in the sparse but clean apartment, watching his team members share stories and laugh, James felt tears in his eyes. He quietly slipped out Linda's photo from his wallet. "You were right," he whispered to her image. "Helping others really does heal your own heart." Back at the facility, Musk had been watching the program's success with interest. The security team's performance metrics were outstanding, but it was the human impact that really caught his attention. He decided it was time to take James' program nationwide. The expansion of James' program started with a simple phone call. Elon Musk had shared the Austin success story with his leadership team, and now Tesla facilities across the country wanted to replicate it. James found himself flying from state to state, telling his story and teaching others how to build similar programs. His first stop was California. Standing in front of Tesla executives, James kept his message simple. He pulled out his old bench photo and shared how one conversation had changed everything. Sometimes, he told them, the best security experts are the ones society has forgotten. The California program started with Pete, a former police detective who'd lost his home during a health crisis. Like James, Pete had been living in his car, his law enforcement experience seemingly worthless in his current situation. Within months, Pete had built his own team, following James's model of combining security expertise with compassion. James's phone started ringing more often. Other companies began reaching out: tech firms, manufacturing plants, even shopping centers. They all wanted to know how to turn their security teams into community builders. One evening, back in Austin, James sat at his desk looking at a map covered in pins, each one marking a location where his program had taken root. He counted over 30 pins now, representing hundreds of lives changed. The desk phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Bill, his first hire, calling from the main gate. "Boss, you need to come down here," Bill said, his voice excited. "There's someone you should meet." At the gate, James found a small group of people, former team members who'd gone on to run their own security programs. They'd gathered to surprise him, each bringing stories of lives transformed and communities improved. One of them stepped forward, an older gentleman named Roy, who now ran security for a major tech company in Dallas. "We wanted you to see what you started," Roy said, gesturing to the group. "That bench out there. It's not just a bench anymore. It's where hope starts for a lot of folks." James looked at the faces around him, remembering each of their stories. Some had been living in shelters, others in their cars. Now they stood tall, proud professionals who'd found their way back. That night, after everyone left, James walked out to his old bench. He sat down, feeling the familiar wood beneath him. A young security guard he'd recently hired was making his rounds. "Evening, sir," the guard said, nodding respectfully. James smiled, remembering when he was the one on the outside looking in. A year had passed since James's program began, and the impact was showing in unexpected ways. The Tesla facility in Austin had become a model of modern security, but more importantly, it had become a symbol of second chances. During his morning walkthrough, James noticed something different. The security team moved with a confidence that went beyond just doing their jobs. They watched out for each other like family. When a new member joined, they'd pitch in to help them get settled, finding apartments, sharing furniture, even cooking meals. One morning, James found a small package on his desk. Inside was a framed photo of his old pickup truck, taken the day he started living in it. There was a note attached. "Sometimes our darkest days lead us to our brightest purpose." It was signed by his entire team. That same day, Elon Musk called an unexpected meeting. The company's security statistics has shown remarkable improvement. Theft was down 80%, employee satisfaction was up, and the communities around Tesla facilities were reporting positive changes. "You've created something special here," Musk said, spreading out reports across the conference table. "But what impresses me most is how it keeps growing by itself." He was right. James' team members had started their own initiatives. Bill had created a mentorship program for at-risk youth. Tom was working with local shelters to identify veterans who needed work. The ripple effect kept spreading. Local businesses had noticed too. They started calling, asking about hiring James's trained security personnel. Some of his team members had moved on to leadership positions in other companies, spreading the program's philosophy further. James still kept Linda's photo on his desk, but now it was surrounded by other pictures: team graduations, success stories, families reunited. Each photo told a story of transformation, of dignity restored. That evening, as the sun set over Austin, James walked out to his bench. He remembered the cold mornings, the uncertainty, the feeling of being invisible. Now, sitting there in his suit, he watched as his team changed shifts, each member greeting him with genuine respect. A new security guard approached, looking nervous. "Sir," he said, "I heard your story. I was wondering, could you tell me how you did it? How you kept going when things were at their worst?" James's program had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. 2 years after that fateful morning on the bench, Tesla's security division had become a model for corporate social responsibility. The numbers told an impressive story. Over 500 former law enforcement officers and veterans had found new purpose through the program. One morning, while reviewing security footage, James noticed something that made him pause. A young man was sitting on his old bench, wearing a worn police uniform. The sight stirred memories, and James headed outside to investigate. The man's name was David, a former police officer who'd lost his job after an injury. He'd heard about James's program and had traveled from Oklahoma, hoping for a chance. His story was familiar: medical bills, lost savings, a family to support. Instead of just offering him a job, James did something different. He asked David to help him take the program to the next level. Together, they created a training academy specifically for former law enforcement and military personnel facing hard times. The academy became James's pride and joy. It wasn't just about security training. It included financial counseling, housing assistance, and mental health support. "We're not just giving people jobs," James would say, "we're rebuilding lives." Elon Musk visited the academy one day, watching as a new class learned about modern security systems. He pulled James aside, clearly impressed. "You've turned a chance encounter into a movement," he said. "How many lives have been changed now?" James didn't need to check his records. He knew exactly: 578 direct hires, plus their families, plus the communities they'd gone on to help. The ripple effect was immeasurable. That evening, after the classes ended, James found himself back on his bench. David joined him, both men watching the sunset over the Tesla facility. "You know," David said, "my kids have their own beds now. Real beds in a real home." James nodded, understanding completely. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Linda's photo. "Sometimes," he said, "the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best things we can do for others." 3 years had passed since that life-changing morning when James Cooper sat on a bench outside Tesla. Now, as regional security director, he stood in front of a crowd at the opening of Tesla's newest security training academy in Austin. The old bench had been moved inside the academy's entrance hall, mounted on a special platform with a small plaque telling its story. It wasn't just furniture anymore. It had become a symbol of hope and transformation. Looking out at the faces in the crowd, James saw his entire journey reflected back at him. There was Bill, now running security for 3 major facilities. Tom, who'd gone on to create veteran support programs across the state. And David, who'd helped turn the academy into a nationally recognized institution. But what made James's heart swell most was seeing the new recruits, men and women who'd hit hard times but refused to give up. They sat straight-backed in their chairs, wearing fresh uniforms, ready to begin their own journeys. Elon Musk stepped up to the podium first. 3 years ago, he said, a chance conversation changed not just one life, but thousands. We didn't just build a security program, we built a family. When it was James' turn to speak, he kept it simple. He pulled out Linda's photo, now worn around the edges. My wife always said that helping others is the best way to heal yourself, he said, his voice steady. Looking at all of you today, I know she was right. The program had grown beyond anything they'd imagined. Over 1,000 former law enforcement officers and veterans had found new careers. Crime rates had dropped in every community where they operated. Other companies had started similar programs, creating a network of support across the country. After the ceremony, James walked alone to the bench. He ran his hand along the worn wood, remembering those cold mornings when it was his only place to rest. Now it stood as a reminder that rock bottom can become a foundation to build something extraordinary. A young recruit approached, hesitant but determined. Sir, she said, they say you still interview every new candidate on that bench. James smiled, patting the space beside him. Pull up a seat, he said. Let's talk about your future. The story of James Cooper, the homeless sheriff, and his bench had become legend. But more importantly, it had become a beginning, not just an ending, for countless others who needed a second chance. The end.